Well, good morning, everyone. I am very excited to be here with Julia being Lindsey. She's going to be talking to us about her new book, Reading Above the Fray. Um, and I think it's one of those nuts and bolts kind of books. For me, it's going on, it's already on my shelf for use in the fall. And I'll be using it with teachers I'm working with, which are teachers K through 3, along with a couple of other things. But this is a really useful, interesting book. That said, I'm going to shut up and let Julia do the talking. Julia, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Well, thank you, Sam, for that lovely introduction to my book. And I do hope that it is useful for teachers as they navigate yet another upcoming school year. So I'm Julia Lindsey, and I started my career in education actually with the Freedom Schools in college, where I was engaged in some literacy teaching over the summers, and it just really got me excited about being a teacher because I loved teaching reading right from the beginning. Then I taught kindergarten and first grade in New York City, and I really loved every aspect of what I was doing. I particularly loved teaching reading and writing and the joy that came with those times of day. And there was always, though, a little bit of a nagging question in my head about what was going on with some of my readers, because I had so many students in my class who were incredible at answering questions in our read aloud time, at trying to come up with creative stories when we were writing, and at getting 100% on every phonics test that I put in front of them. But then when we would get into small group reading instruction, they just didn't get it. They just weren't putting things together. They would struggle with individual words. They would just stare at me when they got to a word they didn't know, or they would kind of parse some things together, and then at the end, they couldn't really say what they had read. And it perplexed me, but I thought, well, I'm a newer teacher. Maybe I'm just not doing everything correct. And I did my best to search for resources and support, but I never quite figured out what to do with some of the students in my classroom. And then fast forward a little bit, I went to the University of Michigan to get my PhD, where I was studying with Nell Duke. And within a month,
By the way, color me green. I am so envious. My gosh.
yes, she
What
is
a mentor.
deeply inspiring to be around.
You
It's true.
are, oh my, OMG. That's just my remark. OMG. Good for
Yes.
you. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think, yeah, it was my luck. And I, within a month, being exposed to her teaching of undergrads and graduate students in teaching methods courses, as well as working with the Boston Public Schools, I realized that my experience was not even remotely unique, and that there were lots of kids across districts and across the country who were having this exact same problem. And there were lots of teachers just like me who were not really sure what was going on and didn't have the right knowledge or resources to figure out what to do. But more surprisingly, I realized that research did know quite a bit of the answers to these questions, and it just simply wasn't being given out to teachers. And that folks just didn't have access to a lot of the information about what to do about getting children to be better appliers of phonics in context so that they can become readers. So that really set me down on a mission and an obsession, and to some extent, around decoding and around how we can create the right atmosphere for the most efficient and effective path towards having automatic word recognizers in our classrooms. And that route really goes through decoding and goes through the right resources that support that process. So I spent my PhD working on foundational skills research, learning a lot about how to do that with summer programs like the Center for Black Educator Development's Freedom Schools program, with the Boston Public Schools, and then later with the District of Columbia Public Schools, as well as with a whole bunch of others around the country. And that's what led to the book, Reading Above the Fray, was hoping to get more of this information out to everyone. And so that we all know what some research-based instructional moves we should be making to ensure that we have the best foundational skills that we can possibly have in our classrooms.
Okay, I'm so certain you've got my reader's attention. Okay, and mine as well. Okay, let's talk about your book, and I'm going to start by saying Nell Duke had this to say in the foreword of your book. Here's the quote. When asked the question, which side are you on, science of reading or balanced literacy, Duke answered the question this way: I'm on the side of research. She goes on to say that your book is taking exactly that tact, being on the side of research. So could you briefly elaborate on what Duke had to say about your book? And I'm going to put up briefly put up a chart from your book to help you with your talking point here. So let's see if I've got that down. There it is. Okay, it's all you again.
Great. Yes, so obviously Nell is an incredible mentor in research and in reading research, understanding research, and figuring out what that research means in application in classrooms. And that is a really special thing to have learned and to have experienced, and something that I want every educator to get access to. And the thing about research is it doesn't always exactly fit with exactly what we want it to say. So rather than adhering to certain rules that people might have based on preconceived notions, what I really try to do, and I believe that this is to be in the spirit of Nell's teaching to me, is to really focus on, well, what does the research actually say? And then we'll use that to inform our understanding, rather than having something that we think we understand and looking for research to confirm our understandings. So when we do that, when we look at the research instead, sometimes things come up that we might be sort of surprised by. So an example of that would be that I think some folks might not think that shared reading is a research-based practice because it has ties to other types of practices that folks don't necessarily think are research-based. But actually, shared reading has a lot of research behind it. There's tons and tons of research on shared reading and on how to do it effectively and how to do it to support foundational skills specifically, if that's the purpose that you're doing with your shared reading. So that's an example of something that if we look directly at the research and then form our understanding, we actually might see something that doesn't necessarily match what we might preconceivedly think. So when I think about that in terms of decoding, what I'm thinking about is, all right, how do we look at the research to try to understand what is the act of decoding? What kinds of skills and knowledge do children need in order to succeed in decoding? And of course, most importantly, what is decoding leading us towards? Because nobody in the world wants a child who's some kind of phonics fact machine, decoding maniac, and then they can't do anything with it. That's certainly not an outcome that most of us would be even remotely happy about, because we know at the end of the day, what we really want are readers and writers. So when we look at the research around decoding, we really see that there's three major elements that flow into this ability to look at letters on a page, spellings on a page, and figure out what word those represent. The first is print concepts. And boy, do these get ignored, but they're so critical to making sure that everyone has a robust understanding of how our print system and how books operate in our classrooms, in particular in pre-K and kindergarten. Print concepts tell us, okay, I can navigate this on the page. I even know that this is a word. If you don't know that they're letters and words, then you can't really do much with it. So that's our first step into decoding. The second thing is phonemic awareness. So knowing that sounds are knowing that you can hear and manipulate individual sounds in language, that phoneme, the k sound at the beginning of cat, for example, is critical in being able to pair sounds and spellings together, and also critical in being able to blend sounds to read a word or segment sounds in order to spell a word. And then, of course, we have probably the most obvious one that we need for decoding, which is alphabet and sound spelling knowledge, knowing what letters are, what they represent in terms of sounds, and then more advanced spelling combinations and what they represent in sounds. And we bring all of these things together in order to execute decoding. We can't decode words if we don't have all of these underlying elements. But more importantly, just because we have all of these elements doesn't mean that we can decode. We also need explicit support in figuring out how to decode and knowing when to deploy that skill. And that does come naturally to some children. Sometimes if you have all of these elements, some children can just kind of put things together, but that's not the case for everyone. And being explicit about something is just the best way that we can say to all of the children in our classroom in an equitable manner, hey, this is what these skills are that we've been working on, and this is what they do, and here's how we can apply them in context. And then, of course, decoding comes together with our knowledge of vocabulary to lead to orthographic mapping, which I'm sure you've all heard of. This is kind of a magical term that's out there right now. But what it means really is the relationship between a word's spelling, pronunciation, and meaning. And it's a kind of memory map that we hold on to, a schema, if you will, about what a word is. And it allows us to really remember that word and also to make connections to other similar words. And all of these things together lead to that automatic word recognition, which is the end goal of all of the foundational skills and all of the exercises around decoding. Because after all, what we want is children who are spending almost no cognitive energy on reading individual words, but who are spending almost all of their cognitive energy on understanding what they're engaged with and becoming deep, meaningful readers.
Okay, and for the sake of that's an awful lot to take in, but for the readers of the blog, I've read the book. Just take a deep dive into chapters 3 through 7, and there's a lot of filling in. How do I do this? How do I do this? It's all there in chapters 3 to 7. So readers of the blog, you got to buy this book. I'm sorry. Shameless promotion. You've got to buy this book and you've got to dig into those chapters. Okay, let's now go into the next thing, and that is in chapters 8 and 9, you talk about the elements used to decode words, and then talk about chunking. And I'm working with a child right now with chunking, and yeah, I have to say your ideas were incredibly helpful. So let me do another share screen and bring up. Come on, there we are. Bring on up the thing about chunking. There's two. We're taking like 3 minutes to talk about 2 full chapters. So there's a lot of details here, but it's all yours. Talk about chunking.
Great. So I think I'll start with just high level, something that is probably shocking because, to be honest, I wasn't even thinking about words this way until I started really getting into the meat of multisyllabic words. But something that we all need to understand is that multisyllabic words are decodable. Just because a word is long doesn't mean it's not a word that we can teach children how to handle it. So that's something that I think is really cool about realizing things about how we can separate words into syllables that are useful and how we can use morphemes in order to help us read bigger and bigger and bigger words. We know from research that children have a lot of trouble transitioning from single syllable words to multisyllabic words, and that even kids who are super successful with single syllable words might really have a lot of trouble with multisyllabic words. And these words are way too long to just say sound by sound and then put it back together and read the word for the most part. So instead, what we need to do is to take on instructional moves that are going to teach children what to do when they encounter these big words, which in most books for adults and even for children over 3rd grade are going to be multisyllabic word heavy. I think that there's estimates, this is in the book, so someone will probably fact check me, but it's, about 80% or more of words in books that kids are exposed to in their later grades are multisyllabic words. So we need to teach them how to handle these words. And essentially, my suggestion is to use chunking, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, chunking a word into decodable parts so that a child can then use sound spelling knowledge to figure out each of those parts and then read through the whole word. Now, how do we chunk a word is the real question. And you see on the screen that I've kind of talked about some of the types of words that children might encounter. This is in reference to the first page of Captain Underpants, which actually, if you know a little bit about compound words and a little bit about morphology, the first page of Captain Underpants is quite decodable for a second and definitely for a 3rd grader. So noticing that real texts that have real authentic stories can be decodable if we have taught the right skills. So the word decodable for books, I know means a lot to a lot of different people, but if we think about it as meaning how many words in a book can a child read based on their knowledge, we can actually notice that a lot of books become decodable as children learn more and more skills. So in this case, I'm talking about a couple different things. The first is that there's some syllable types that are super helpful for teaching children how to chunk words in parts. So knowing how to cut a word by the compounds and reading each word and then putting them together. Knowing that you can cut a word at consonants is also very helpful and stable. And then on the other side, teaching some morphology. So this is teaching children that there are small parts of words that hold individual meaning and that they're very standard. Morphemes are super cool because they can tell us a lot of stuff all at once. Morphemes have very, very structured and systematic spellings, pronunciations, and meanings. So when we encounter things like re, we know that they mean, again, we know that it's spelled re, and we know that it's pronounced re. And so we can use that information to read tons and tons and tons of words, even though all we've done is actually learn 2 letters. So in this case, what you'll see on the screen is a little bit of information about how children can actually encounter pretty big words, but with certain skills that we've practiced and explicitly supported them with, they can actually learn how to read tons and tons of big, big words. And in the case of morphology, also know what those words mean.
Okay, and I'll point out to the readers again that this is a headline service. To really get into the nuts and bolts of what you're talking about, you need to go read chapters 8 and 9, and it's all there. Okay, so finally, and let me stop the share screen here. Okay, and finally, I noticed you referenced one of my favorite people in the world, Tim Rosinski and Chessman Smith, in their Mega Book of Fluency and the whole idea of fluency. And your specific quote is, you call for less fluency as speed reading and more holistic fluency. And before I say care to elaborate, I'm going to put a plug in for the blog. I've talked Dr. Rosinski into talking about his book in August. So readers of the blog, be on the lookout for that. That's something that'll be coming up. But right now, it's all you. And gosh, you mean we don't have to get into it's not really about reading real, so how fast can you go? And gosh, you mean we're not trying to get auction people together? That's not our goal. Could you elaborate about that? And I guess all the people that want to become auctioneers are going to be very sad about what you say. And that's me being sarcastic. Okay, here we go. Take it away.
Yeah. So a lot of the time, one of the most important parts of fluency gets completely lost when we're talking about it. So fluency is automatic and accurate reading, but it's also reading with prosody. So reading with that appropriate expression, reading with the right pauses, reading like many of us listen to adults or ourselves reading out loud. That's what we're talking about when we mean prosody for young children.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you for a second and put a plug in for Tim. His Mega Book of Fluency has a wonderful rubric that you can train people with on prosody. And one of the things that I always try to, when I'm working with teachers, is to talk them into using that, because that makes all the difference in the world. I call it reading like a storyteller. Tim has other names for it, but his rubric is gold, and it's in the Mega Book. So I'm sorry, I just had to put that in. Okay.
No problem. So the reason that fluency matters is because fluency is very related to comprehension. And historically, we've thought that fluency predicted comprehension in the sense that fluency came first. Now we know that there's a little bit more nuance to that. And there's a lot of conversation in the field right now about actually, is fluency sometimes a result of in the moment comprehension? But the idea is that fluency is really about comprehension in that kind of step between word recognition and isolation and into comprehension. And one of the most important parts of that is then prosody, which is this expression and the timing and phrasing and rhythm. Because if you're comprehending something in the moment, or if you are reading it with those kinds of elements, then you are obviously going to be experiencing a different text, a different emotional experience for sure, and therefore a different comprehension of that text. So that's kind of where fluency fits into this. So we can't just say that speed reading is what's going to equal comprehension when we think about kind of bridging from foundational skills into comprehension. We really need to think about how our children reading, as you said, reading like a radio host, or reading like they're engaged in emotionally. So when we think about fluency supports, really looking for, like in Tim's book, really looking for strategies that support prosody as well. And that's not to say that you can't do some rereadings and speed readings and that sort of thing. Of course, if that's your purpose for that particular moment, then that's great. And I think that if there was anything I hoped folks take away from the book, it's that when you are working on foundational skills, you should have a purpose in mind for what you're doing with children. And if you realize that the activity you've chosen doesn't match your purpose or isn't supporting children's growth towards that purpose, you've probably picked the wrong activity. And that's okay, but we can't really recognize that we picked the wrong activity if we don't have a purpose first. So always making sure that you know what it is that you're going into that foundational skills block thinking about. And if it's prosody, then don't pick a speed reading activity. Or if it's decoding, then don't pick a text that kids can't use those decoding skills to work on. Or if it's instead, oh, I'm working on recognizing a graphic, of an advanced print concept, then don't pick a book that has no graphics. So really recognizing what is your purpose? Do you have the right materials in front of you? And then are children actually experiencing that purpose? And that extends, as I said, into this prosody and fluency discussion as well.
Okay. Well said. And you made something trip in my mind. In my various training and being trained, one little planning trick that I've learned is, what work are you leaving for the child and why? Mm-hmm. If you have a good answer to that question, what work are you leaving for the child and why, then you're going to have a good lesson plan. So that's just kind of piggybacking on what you said. Okay.
I love that.
So now we are to that point where, what else? It's wide open. Any closing remarks? I'm going to put the plug in for you, folks. If you don't buy this book, you're missing out on a great opportunity. This is quite literally on my shelf, and I'm using it right now to help me with my planning for the fall. So so I put the plug in for you. But any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think my final thought would just be that I think that we all who have taught reading before have felt that magic of the moments that kids are reading, and we feel that magic, that spark in the air, and that excitement that comes along with that. And I think that there has been some misconception about if we're too systematic or too explicit, or we focus on decoding instead of other things, that we're going to be losing that spark. But I would encourage folks to see it a different way. And the different way that I would encourage people to see it is that the magic isn't for us. It's not for the educators or the teachers in the room. We are actually doing a ton of very, very skilled work to try to make the magic happen for a child. And that magic can happen for a child when they're doing something that seems silly to us sometimes, like decoding an individual word. And I have seen that moment, and I know other teachers who have, and there's even a story in the book about a kindergarten teacher who saw this moment of when a child can actually use their own independent skills to decode a word, to decode a sentence, to decode a whole book, and realize that they are a reader. That is joyful, that is magical, and that's a spark that we want to foster, even though it might feel a little bit different than other ways that we teach or have taught reading before. And it might feel like a little bit more on the side of us, not so magical, because we know all the hard work that's gone into it, but that's okay, because we're preserving that magic for the students and we're creating those readers that way.
Okay, perfectly said. Thank you so much. Okay, we have a final tradition in any Bomarito blog interview, and that is we say goodbye by doing a Zoom wave goodbye. So now's that time. And great. Wave away. Goodbye, everybody. And thank you so much for a wonderful set and for writing that wonderful book. Bye, everybody.
Bye.